This photograph was never meant to be seen. In 1909, a wealthy family posed for a portrait to hang in their home for generations. In the corner of the end, there's a child that tried to erase from history. And the historian discovered his name in ledger decades later. They exposed a secret powerful people buried for over 100 years. The boy wasn't him because he ain't belong. The ledger lay open beneath a trembling candle, its pages thin as breath, its ink faded to the color of dried leaves. Outside, winter pressed its face against the windows of a quiet estate in Hawthorne, Connecticut, and the wind moved through bare branches, warning that no one in the house dared to speak aloud. In the hush between the ticking of the clock and the soft creak of the beams above, a truth waited, sealed not had wrought or agreed, that strong little bots hidden beneath slated riders. Without the full breath inside that carried danger, it was the absence that tried to keep. In the winter of 1909, when the snow fell in thin, careful lines across the fields and the river slowed in his skin of ice, a faintly prepared to mirror, the parlor had been arranged like a steed. Velvet cushions the smooth. These curtains were pulled just far enough to let the pale afternoon light spill in. The matted patriarch took a seat at the stone to a man who believed his name would outlast him. His wife folded her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the lens as if she were already looking into the future. Their eldest son stood behind them, shoulders squared, chin lifted, learning the posture inheritance. In the corner of the room where the light did not quite reach, something else weighed. A photographer had arrived that morning with frost still clinging to his coat and ink stains on his fingers. He was a trifling man, who moved from town to town with a camera in the sack of glass plates wrapped in cloth. His work was to picture moons, to track from inside frames so they could be carried forward when memory failed. He'd seen laughter frozen and soon, he'd seen grief turn to shine. He believed Laud's work that the lens was honest in ways people are odd. He sat his tripod and polished floor of the parlor and adjusted the height carefully not to scratch the wood. He looked with a friend he saw the fan arranged themselves away from the eastern wall. Chairs were shifted, the small table was moved. The light was guided almost gently away from a narrow corner near the tall cabinet that held the good china. It was not a dramatic movement, it was subtle. The kind of change made by people who were practical. He did not ask why. The shutter clicked, and the sound echoed through the house like a door closing. If the glass plate captured in that instant would not be spoken of for decades. It would not be written to the ledgers that tracked every purchase, every donation, every expense made to the family's name. It would not be mentioned in the letters sent to friends in other towns, letters that spoke of markets and weather and the fine condition of the horses. It would leave instead in the dark corner of the brain, a small shape, still and watching like a thought that refused to leave. The house seemed to understand the weight of that moan. Its halls absorbed footsteps the way church absorbs prayer. The floors creaked in certain places, as if remembering who had passed over them before. Candles left thin rivers of wax along the window sills, pale trails that hardened into quiet monuments to time slipping away. Even the air carried a sense of floating back, as though the walls themselves were careful not to breathe too loudly. In the kitchens, servants moved with the soft efficiency people who learned how to be pleasant without being noticed. The whispers stayed low, sipping between the clatter of dishes and the crackle of the fire. This spoke small things, a storm coming in from the north, a delivery that was late, a neighbor's new baby. They did not speak of the boy who slept in the narrow room above the pantry. He was not meant to be spoken in. His room was barely more than a space carved out of the house's upper reaches where the ceiling sloped down the beams pressed close. A single small window dat over the back of the property toward the fields and the trees that knocked the air to the lane. In the winter, frost traced patterns in the grass, and there was sometimes put his fingers against them, watching the shapes fade and turn. The bed was narrow. The blanket was thin. His world was quiet. He learned early that quiet was kind of safe. During the day, he moved through the house with small tasks, carrying coal to the hearth, wiping ash from the grate, delivering notes full tight their words hidden frame. He best was spaces that did not belong to him, careful not to leave marks. The lady of the house referred to him as the helper, what was quiet and distant, as if she were named a tool with a person. The master did not refer to him at all. Names had weight in that house. They were carved in the stone outside the church. They were written bold strokes at the top of leads, They've spoken of respect in the town shops and offices. The boy's name was not given that kind of life. It lead only in a soft care for horses the servants, and even there was often latan sad with wait wide Dwayne's hod pauls. Winter 1809 mood fort in thy dated winters do. Snow thou, snow moted. The river cracked and shifted under the cold. The family attended church, their coats brushed clean, their boots polished. At their place in pew as bowed hands fold. The boy did not go there. He stayed behind to polish the very boots they wore to pray. The portrait once devout and framed that hung in the prior, cast admired and eyed. They commented on the fine drapery, on the way the light caught the patriarch's face, on the crowd stance of the sun. They spoke of how well the family would be remembered, how the image seemed to capture something lasting. Something noticed the shadow in the corner, most did not. Those who often chose not to say anything, carrying the question home than the unlit candle. The boy sometimes stood in a doorway the par when no one else was there. He looked at the portrait of the fear frozen time. He met lick the core. He knew where it was. Letters from that winter still exist, pressed between the brittle pages of a ledger that now rests in a box in an archive. They speak of storms that arced down fences, of a market had taken turn, of dinner party that went on longer than expected. It will not speak of the child, not in words, not in ink. His presence is there only in the spaces between sentences, in the careful way certain things are now measured. Power in the house lived on main flaw. It lived in the wide rooms and the heavy furniture and the portraits of ancestors who stared down from gilded frames. Their eyes followed movement, or seemed to. They were men and women toward built names that lasted, who'd passed those names down like heirlooms. Their faces were reminders of what the family believed it ought to be. Obedience lived below that. It lived in the narrower halls and the back staircases and the rooms where the light was weaker and the air colder. It lived in the rhythm of work done quietly and quickly. It lived in the boy's careful steps as he moved from task to task, learning how to exist in a space that did not claim him. Some would claim those 2 worms. He learned how claim's secret could be. The photographer left town a few days after the portrait was taken. He packed his camera in his glass plates and moved on to the next place, the next family, the next moon to be preserved. He had not knew what he had captured beyond the surface of the image. He would not know how the small shape in the corner of that frame would linger unseen but present for years. Time moved as it always does. The boy grew taller. His hands grew stronger. His tasks changed. The servant who had whispered his name in the kitchen came and went, some merry, some moved away. The house remained, its walls holding out to the quaint at the tap. The framing's name continued to appear in the town's records. Donations to the church, contributions to public works. Their reputation grew steady and solid. Respectability became a kind of armor polished and worn in public. What lay beneath it was not discussed. The portrait remained on the wall, its shadowed corner darkening with age. It did not demand attention. It waited. Years later, when the house would change and the old furniture would be sold off, and the beams in the attic would creak under the weight of new footsteps, the small wooden box would still be there. It would sit beneath the slanted roof, gathering dust, its contents sealed away by a decision made long before. The danger all along had never been what the photograph showed. I was in what asked, who was the child of the dark core, and why had he been left there? Dark history voices, chanted to expanded script, eye-rocking the walls. The hands did not rise from the glide by Atsin. It was built with attention, with long drawn out to thong paid by thong. Wide staircases for those who were meant to be seen. Narrow passages for those who were meant to pass through quietly. High ceilings for voices that carried weight. Low doorways for heads that learned to bow without being told. Even though the boy learned to read, he learned to shed power by walking through its shadow. On the main floor, polished banisters curved like steady hands guiding guests toward wounds filled with light and space. Oil paintings lined the walls, their frames heavy with gold aid. Faces stared down from within, men and women tossed in old stout, their expressions set in the calm confidence of people who believed their names would not fade. The boy felt their eyes on him when he passed. Ian did not look up. He moved faster in those halls, careful not to leave the mark where he ducked blond. Below that level the air changed. The corridors now, the walls closed in. The light came from smaller windows and flickering lamps that left more shadow than glow. The sound of the house was different here. The grand rooms above echoed with conversation and music. The lower halls carried the softer rhythm of work, the scrape of the broom, the clink of a pan, the quiet breath of people who learned to speak only when need. The boy walked between these two worlds, nearly claimed by ear. The days began to where I fished rising. He carried coal in a small bucket, feeling the cold dust create the errands. He waked the ash from a hearth, worked him break lies leaf than sallow rim of war. He livered notes folded tight, their edges worn soft from being passed between rooms where he was not invited to stay. Each task ended to the night. Each moment was measured not in time, but what still need to be done. Names were spoken around him, but rarely to him. The lady of the house called him to help her, her voice light. Why is it? The worn fond Micah sobbed, never quite master shape. The master's voice did not fought it in thaw. He passed through him, over him, rounded, as if the boy were part of the furniture rather than a person moving through the room. In the kitchen, with a whoop of the stove softened the edges of the day, rumors lit like a second fire. They flickered and changed shaping every telly. A maid said the boy had arrived one night years ago, wrapped to a blanket and carried by one whose face no one remembered. Another said the one had carved at the door, not that enough to wake the arse, but lad enough to lose the work and lose who rue. A third said the boy's eyes matched the master's too closely to be a coincidence. The same color. The same way they narrowed when the light was too bright. The whispers never rose past the ceiling. They stayed in the kitchen and the narrow halls and the rooms where voices were trained to be careful. A bug in the wide spaces and tall rooms, silence kept this place. The moral decay that has to matinate itself, did not come with raised voices or broken themes. It did not leave bruises on walls or marks on the floor. It settled instead like dust. Settled in the way doors closed when the boy entered a room. It settled in the way conversations paused just for continuing eyeing. It settled in the way the family gathered for church on Sundays, their coats brushed clean, their hands full in prayer, while the boys stayed behind the parse the boots they will wear to ask for forgiveness. The ledgers tell the Catholic story. Every expense is written in neat lines ink. Food, repairs, donations, the cost of candles, the cost of coal. The cost of keeping the house warm through winter. There was no line for the cost of keeping a child hid in plain sight. No number to the wave a seeker carried through the years. Power is a way teaching people what not to see. The boy learned this lesson ori. He learned to stand still when spoken and visible when spoken all. He learned to listen for his name even he knew not call. He learned that laughter belonged to others, and that when he saw his reflection in the silver serving tray, it looked like someone else's life looking back at him. Outside the house, Latam told a different story. The patriarch was known as a generous man. He donated to the church. He shook hands with judges and merchants. His name appeared on cornerstones and memorial plaques. People spoke in with respect, sometimes even with pride, as if his success belonged to them as well. His reputation was a kind of shield, polished and held high in public. Inside the house, silence did the work of protection. It filled the spaces where questions might lead. It smoothed under the edges of moans that did not fit the story the family told about. It taught everyone from the servants to the guests which subjects were safe and which were kind of left alone. The portrait and parlor reached and high into place, a family folded in a mobility cavalry. The velvet cushions, the lace curtains, the proud posture, and in the corner the shadow that grew darker with each passing season as if the image itself were drawing in the quiet it was surrounded by. Is stood in front of it and admired the scene. They spoke of the quality of the work, of how well the photographer captured the light. Some noticed the dark corner, most did not. Those it often chose not to mention. They smiled, they nodded, they moved on to safer topics. The boy sometimes stood at the edge of the room and watched them watch the portrait. He wondered what they saw, he wondered what they did not. As the years passed, his body changed in ways the us did not. He grew taller, his shoulders broad, his hands grew strong for carrying and lifting clean. The tasks grew higher, but the net grew fewer. The servants would whisper about them, and the kitchen came and went, their stores carried away with the new faces took their portrait, and whispers began again, softer each time, as if the house itself were teaching them how quiet to be. A boy learned the shape of the town beyond the gates. He learned which streets were wide and which were narrow, which shops welcomed him and which watched him closely. He learned how people looked at him when he walked behind the family a step or two by, close enough to be seen, far enough to the supper. Some eyes held curiosity, some held nothing how. He learned too how respect could be borrowed. When he walked with the family, doors opened more easily. Voices were kinder. When he walked alone, the world felt heavier, as if the air itself asked him to prove that he belonged. The house continued to gather years the way it gathered dust. The paint on the walls faded. The wood on the stairs wore thin in the places where feet passed most often. The portrait's frame dulled. The shadow in the corner deepened. The master grew older. Lines appeared in his face, ground by time and by the work of keeping the life and older. His public smile remained. His private silences grew longer. The lady of the house moved through the rooms with a grace that had learned to hide awareness. Their eldest son took on word the fairness business, stepping to the shape and preparing. The boy watched on. He watched the rituals of power and respect play out day to day, the handshakes, the meetings, the polite words exchanged over tea. He watched the way decisions were made in rooms where he did not stand. He felt the effects of those decisions in the tasks he was given, in the places he was allowed to be, in the places he was not. Sometimes late at night, when the house had gone still and the only sound was the wind against the windows, he would sit on a narrow bed in a small room and listen. He listened to the creak of the beams. He listened to the distant ticking of the clock. He listened to the silence and wondered what was me. The roomers in the kitchen never found a place in the ledgers with the letters. They never crossed the threshold into the parlor or the study. They lived and died in the soft air near the stove, passed from one careful mouth to another. And yet the boy felt them. He felt them the way people look at him and then looked away. He felt them the way the master's gaze sometimes linger, just from on too long before moving on. He felt them in the way the lady of the eyes kept her disties, her polite as it were, built from small, careful testers. The portrait remained, its quiet witness unchanged. Seasons passed. Snow gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall. The fields outside the house changed color. The river swelled and shrunk. The town grew swellly in ways that were easy to miss if you did not look closely. The boar continued to grow, measured not by marks on doorframe, but by the deepening of the shaft that seemed to file on. He did not know what the future would hold. He did not know what name would one day be written, or if it would be written at all. He only knew the shape of that house, the way the tasks and the quiet that filled the spaces where answers had been. And somewhere in the walls and the dust and the wood and silence, the truth lay. Not loud, not ray, just there. Waiting for no one would no longer be to stay eaten. The truth did not ride with sand. It ride on paper, and priests were known looking for it, beneath a stack of forgotten books and chipped porcelain in a narrow second-hand shop that smelled of old wood and colder memories. Outside, the street carried the noise of a newer world. Engines and voices and footsteps that did not know the name of the house or the boy, with a shadow that had once laid a corner of a par. Inside, dust drifted slowly through a being pale light, and ledger waited to be open. Historian looked on searching for anything particular. He the kind of man who questions the way others follow roads, not knowing where they would lead, only knowing they were there. His fingers were stained in aid of court or fair at the parse. Elite perchars with the poor carousel where stood that paper could be more fragile than glass. When he pulled the ledger free, it came loose with a soft sound, like a breath being released. The cover was cracked, the spine leaned to one side. The pages inside were thin and yellowed, their edges rough, tiny chewed. It smelled of dust and oil and the faintest hint of smoke as I had once been stored near a hearth. It was the cane book no one loosed, the cane book that to mine out its imprints. He turned the bees slowly. The entries were neat, lined at Cathas creaked. Numbers balanced against numbers. Purchases and donations, repairs and deliveries, a house reduced to ink and order. The historian's eyes moved across the page, trained to notice patterns to see what did not belong, and then he saw it. In the margin of one page, squeezed between two tidy columns, there was a name. It was not written in the same hand. The letters were uneven, hurried, as if the writer had been looking over their shoulder. The ink was darker, pressed into the paper with a kind of urgency. Beneath the name with a date, winter, 1909, and beside it a single word, born. The page seemed to grow heavier in his hands. He closed the ledger and opened it again as if the word might change. It did not. It stayed where it was, small and stubborn in the margin, a quiet refusal to be erased. The historian felt the familiar pull of a story beginning to move. He took the ledger again, wrapping it in brown paper, caring that whose were something that could be damaged by the air. That night he sat at his desk under a lamp that hummed softly, its light pulling over the pages like a spotlight on a stage. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that the past was being lifted back into view. He followed the name. First to the church wickers, thick books bound in leather, their pages marked by generations' hands. Attends, marriages, burials. The ink here was darker, the lines straighter. Names filled the pages on steady roads, each one a small claim to being remembered. He searched for the boy's name. It was not there. He searched for the family's name. It was there again and again. Donations, memorials, special mentions in the margins, written in the careful hand of a clerk who knew the value of respectability. The absence felt deliberate. He moved on to property deeds, brittle papers that smelled of mold and old glue. They told the story of the house in lines and measurements, who owned it, when it changed hands, what it was worth at each moment in time. The family's name had changed at the top of the page, bold and clear. The boy's name did not appear at all. Letters came next. Some were stored in boxes at a local archive. Others had been tucked into family papers donated to the town years after the house was sold. They stoned in, unfolded them carefully, reading words written for eyes long gone. They spoke of weather and business and polite visits. They spoke of births and deaths, the fit public store of the family. They did not speak of the boy. And yet sometimes between the lines he felt him, a pause where sentence had been, a change in tone that suggested something left unsaid, a reference to the situation that was never explained. Each letter was a piece of a wall built to keep something in. The trail grew clearer with each stump, his servant's dismissal recorded in small town notes, a sudden move, a gap in the records where names had been, a pattern of silence that when placed side by side began to look like a sheet. The boy was not a helper. He was not an orphan. He was blood. The master's blood. The realization did not strike like a blow. It settled slow and heavy like snow on a roof. The historian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the pieces arrange themselves. A relationship hidden behind closed doors. A pregnancy concealed behind a servant's dismissal. A child raised in the shadow of his own inheritance. The portrait in 1909 had not captured a stranger in the quarter. It had captured a son. The historian returned to the ledger, to the name in the margin. He traced the letters with his finger, careful not to press too hard. He imagined the hand that had written them. Was it the servant S, the master S, sitting out competing loyalty and fear? The word born sat there, small and brave. It did not explain anything. It explained everything. The revelation though not arrive like thunder. It arrived like dawn, slow and quiet, like creeping into a room that had been that for too hard. The family's public acts of charity, their donations to the church, their careful image of respectability took on a different shape when seen through the lens of what they had denied. The boy's absence from the records was not an oversight. It was a choice. The historian felt the weight of that choice in every page he turned. Each blank space wore a name job in, each careful line avoided what lay just beneath. He wanted to see the police wanted on the gun. The house still stood, though it had been divided into apartments as grand ruins cut into smaller spaces. The polished banisters were worn. The oil paintings were gone. The wide holes now held doors with numbers on them, each one leading to a different life. He walked through the front entrance and felt the air change. The past did not greet him. It waited. He found his way to what had once been the parlor. The space was smaller now, a living room with modern furniture and a window carved by plain curtains. The wall where the portrait had hung was bare, but the corner was still there, still dark, still quiet. He stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building, footsteps above, a door closing down the hall, the hum of a radio somewhere else. Life moving somewhere, unaware of the shall remain. He imagined the boy standing in that corner, small and still, watching family pose for a memory to include. He imagined if a tongue for lifting his calm, seeing shape but not asking the question. He imagined the moment the shutter clicked, freezing a truth that would take decades to be spoken. Some truths do not echo when they are finally said. They settle. They move into the walls, into the floors, into the quiet spaces where people once stood and not seen. It become part of the air, something you feel without knowing why. A historian left the house and walked down street, the ledger tucked in his arm. He felt as though he were carrying more than paper. He was carrying a life that had been folded away. He began to write, not in the neat columns of accounts, but in long lines that tried to give shape to what had been missing. He wrote about the house and the portrait and the boy in the dark corner. He wrote out the name, the margin, and the word that refused to disappear. The story moved the world quiet first as the whisper passed from one person to another. A local journal printed in paper in a nearby town, then sound farther away asked about the hats, about the family, about the child. The past, once sealed, had begun to breathe. The historian knew that what he had uncovered would not change what had happened. It would not give the boy a different childhood or a place in the portrait where he had once stood in shadow. What it would get in something else. It would get in holding new lives inside its walls. But somewhere in a ledger and in a story and in the quiet memory of a town, a boy who had once been hidden had been brought into the light. Some names only betrono in the silence can no longer hold them. The past does not ask for forgiveness. It's not new, not whisper apologies. It waits patient in the spaces we've abandoned, in the dust that sells on shelves no one opens, in the margins of books that no one reads anymore. Sometimes it speaks quietly, almost imperceptibly, until someone leans close enough to hear. The story of the boy in the dark corner did not begin with outrage, or it erect with scan. It began like a murmur, a half-forgotten note, a journal that few had noticed, its words simple, precise, and yet heavy with everything that had been kept from sight. When it first appeared in print, in the local journal between reports of town meetings and harvest accounts, no one suspected the tremor it would cause decades later. The paragraph was measured, careful, almost polite. It spoke of a house, of a family, and of a child whose light had been carried in silence, as if the house itself had decided to forget. The historian who later uncovered this note would describe it as a whisper trapped in paper, a truth smuggled into the daylight when no one was looking. Pause, the family's name once engraved in stone memory like became footnote, not scandalous, not judgmental, just present, lingering in the margins where a child's existence had been erased. People read it and passed on, leaving the inked letters to settle into mind that weren't ready for the way to carried. The article did not trap. It allowed the past to speak softly, and sometimes soft is louder than a cry. In quiet homes and a hush of kitchens after supper, people lingered on the words. They lit up photographs on their walls of the houses they had grown up around, the streets they had always walked without noticing, and they began to wonder how many lives had been carried in sands, unmarked, unnoticed, unremembered. Some then knew the house immediately. Some recognized the family. Others recognized the unspoken truth of silence itself, and how easy it is to live inside a story that is never written down. Palms, visitors started to arrive, not crowds, not tourists, just individuals drawn by curiosity, by the soft insistence of the story. Along the notebook, claiming a grandma had once worked in the kitchens of the estate, a student who wanted to see what remained of a house that had once contained such a secret. They approached slowly, looking for traces in the worn steps, the uneven brick, the shadows at the edges of windows. The house had aged, its paint peeling in the corners, its ivy-high claimed walls and porch alike. The windows were flicked to the sky but the inside hidden, and those reflections, the shape of the past like, slowly marching. The corner of the parlor where portrait once hung remained shadowed, even when sunlight streamed through at the windows. A memory carved into architecture, a silence embedded in beams. People could sense it even if they could not name it. Pause. The town council convened in quiet deliberation, not for spectacle, not for accolade, but because the story demanded knowledge. Papers were spread across tables, old photographs laid out carefully, letters enfolded and flattened, documents traced by fiends that trimmed them slightly with the wrong covering. How does one commemorate a child who had been spaced between visibility and invisibility? How does one honor a life denied acknowledgement for nearly a century? For the century was mentored, deliberate, respectful. A plaque, small, unassuming, not among the obtrusive sigh, just a piece of metal near the entrance, cemented into place as quietly the story itself had been hidden. It spoke of what had been denied, and what could finally be told without fear. Powerless. The words out lack were simple. A not near the child, a not cures, a not call for gentry. They said simply that a child had lived here, that the family had been divided by silence, that history had finally allowed a space for recognition. The moral weight of the house existed in admission. It did not demand celebration nor apology. It existed like the toll allowing the story to settle inside them as it had settled into the walls for decades. Pause. The ledger, the one that first revealed the child's existence in a margin scribbled hurried ink, had found its place in archive. Behind glass, climate-controlled, preserved for visitors who leaned close, squinting to the site where the fate strokes. The word that had changed everything, born, set them, and adorned with Thusan to be hidden again. People bent to proceed to connect the dot between a life once erased, a life finally cared for. Some felt the weight immediately. Some felt a chill, a shiver, a cognition. Others felt nothing. That too was part of the story. The silence of a world that often overlooks the quiet wee truth arrived late and undeniably. Pause. The boy lay, reconstructed from fragmented rickets, remained mostly unshuttled. Few others survived. We imaginedly perished donkeys, notes tucked between Peters ledgers that rarely left the shelves. No one grand memoirs. No one recorded triumphs, just small, quiet signs of existence. And yet now even those quiet signs mattered. Even those fragments became something permanent. They carried truth where memory had failed. They carried knowledge when repellery had once demanded erasure. The boy's footsteps no longer echoed in the halls of that old house, yet they remained alive in stories and records in the plaque by the entrance and the margin of ledger held behind glass. Quiet. The house, now divided into apartments, continued its life. The walls had changed, paint peeled and was replaced, floors were repaired, rooms were repurposed. Yet corners remained corners, halls stretched the same distances, shadows linger where they once been heaviest. And casually in the right light in the quiet of an afternoon, a visitor could feel the weight of the wife once hidden. They could cinch the child in the dark corner, still watching, still prisoned, a shape that no photograph or document could fully capture, yet one that demanded to be remembered. Pause. The family's power had faded with time. Portraits would no longer display the parlor. Statues and plaques bearing the family name stood only as artifacts of a world that passed. Respectability, once carefully constructed, aged slowly under the wave of truth. Yet amidst the shitness and memory, the boy's name endured, small and squat, preserved. One, written in ink that refused to vanish, that refused to let history ignore what had been hidden. Recognition, delayed but irrevocable, had finally arrived. Pause. In moments of quiet, when a wind moved through the trees and the distant church bell rang, the story spoke again. Not of noise, not an accusation, not in judgment, the acknowledgement. The spaces between sentences, the shadowed corner of a room, the soft ring peed, all carried patents. Some sat to listen, some did not. But it was there nevertheless, persistent, patient, waiting for those who sought to know. Pause. No courtroom had judged, no scandal had erupted. The story did not need that. Justice in this case was a quiet theme, administered slowly through acknowledgement and remembrance. It existed in the ability of a child's existence to finally recognize. It existed in the way people paused before the old house, in the way visitors leaned over glass cases and archives, in the quiet admiration for the permanence of a word once hurried, once hidden, now preserved. Truth, it seemed, was the only inheritance that could not be restored. Pause. The moral echo of the house lives in that simplicity. Not loud, not triumphant, just present, a statement of existence, a proof that the past, while unkind, does not go entirely unanswered. That memory once reclaimed can bear witness where power once demanded a ratio. That a name once written in a hurried hand on a dusty page can finally claim its place in history, unalterable, undeniable. Pause. Sunny hinge when the sun falls low and casts long shadows over the town. Some walking past the old house might catch sight of the plaque. They might pause, read, reflect. Think of the child who was denied acknowledgement for decades, the family who lived behind facades, the stories held in silence. They might feel a subtle weight settle in their chest, a quiet understanding of what it means to exist unrecorded, and then finally what it means to exist remembered. Pause. The ledger remains behind glass. The plaque stands quietly by the entrance. The house endures, repurposed, repainted, lived in. And the story of the boy in the dark corner endures with them. Born, remembered, known, no longer hides in shadows or margins. It has arrived, And for that reason it matters. Pause. Some names only find peace when the truth is told. Some names only return when the silence can no longer hold them. The wrecker was cold, but the mingery refused to be.